The debt trap. Why private equity wants your power company. The elevator stopped between floors as the lights flickered, then died. Down the street, a substation coughed sparks into a black winter sky. At the hospital, the generator caught, then stuttered. Call centers rang out, busy tones recorded apologies, then nothing. People lit candles. Phones slipped to 1%. Here's what almost no one on that block knew. Their public utility wasn't public. It was a leveraged buyout wrapped in holding companies and covenants. Debt came first, maintenance came later. We're going to follow one buyout, one town, and one storm. Regulators had warning signs months before. To understand why, we need to rewind. The buyout that rewired a town. It started at a hotel 4 towns over, where the utilities board signed the term sheet in a quiet conference room that smelled like burnt coffee. The buyer wasn't a household name. It was a fund, capital pooled from pension plans, endowments, and wealthy families, moving through a chain of special-purpose vehicles built to do one thing: borrow heavily by the company and extract cash while the lights stayed on. On paper, the deal looked clean. A premium over book value for a distribution utility with steady cash flows and a captive customer base. The financing stack knitted together senior secured loans, a slice of unsecured notes, and a revolving credit line. The operating company sat 2 floors down the corporate tower. The debt lived above it, at a holding company that pledged dividends from the utility as collateral. The covenant package was tight: minimum interest coverage, restrictions on new borrowing, and triggers that would lock the cash box if performance dipped. The models said the town could carry it. Interest rates were still manageable, and the projections had line items labeled synergies: shared services, procurement savings, and, highlighted in yellow, workforce optimization. Maintenance capex would stay disciplined. Growth capex would be strategic. The bankers expected a quick rate case when within 18 months to rebase revenues and cover a chunk of the financing bill. Back home, the utility's physical story was less tidy. Poles at the edge of town leaned after summer storms. Vegetation grew tight around lines that crossed an old rail corridor. A substation near the river had flood maps tacked to a bulletin board. Someone had underlined the 1 in 100 year line 3 times. Everyone knew the backlog. Crews knew which feeders ran hot in summer and snapped under ice in January. A director of operations kept a list of transformers nearing end of life taped inside his locker. Within weeks of closing, the email cadence changed. A new CFO dialed into staff meetings and talked in acronyms: EBITDA, NPV, WACC. Headcount plans were reassessed. Voluntary separation packages went to older line workers who knew every alley and easement by heart. Call center staffing moved to an outsourcer 1 time zone away. Vegetation management got trimmed, literally, switching from a 3-year cycle to a 4-year cycle, then a risk-based approach that favored denser neighborhoods and deferred the long rural laterals. Vendors felt it too. A family-run contractor that supplied crossarms and hardware got a new master agreement. 90-day pay terms, performance penalties, and a promise of volume that never quite materialized. Mutual aid agreements were rationalized, prioritizing partners inside the fund's growing utility portfolio. It made sense on a spreadsheet: consolidate, negotiate, standardize. In the field, it meant fewer relationships to call when winds topped 60 miles an hour. The rate case arrived right on schedule. The filing was dense with tables showing a modernization plan, storm hardening, and smart meters. Buried in the appendices, the company proposed riders and trackers to true up costs quarter by quarter. The philosophy was simple: shift variability to customers, hold earnings steady for lenders and equity. Regulators pushed, then signaled openness. Reliability metrics would be met, the company promised. Service quality penalties were minor compared to the size of the debt service. Inside the operating company, the difference between maintenance capex and growth capex turned into a quiet game. Growth projects, meters, IT systems, anything with a clean rate-based story, moved forward. Maintenance, replacing those aged transformers and reclusers the crews flagged, slipped a quarter, then 2. Accounting helped, reclassifying some maintenance as capital when it could be bundled into system upgrades. Cash flowed up. Fees flowed out. Management fees to the fund, advisory fees for integration, and a dividend recap 6 quarters in that refinanced the debt and sent a distribution to investors. For a while, numbers smiled. The lights mostly stayed on. Sadie and Sci-Fi, The reliability measures that customers never read but executives lived by were inside targets. The company reported continuous improvement, touting automated switches and a new outage map. Crews were still proud. They found ways to make do. A foreman kept a private stash of bolts because the warehouse order cycle stretched to the next fiscal month. But there were early tells. A summer microburst took down trees along the rail corridor, and restoration lagged. The call center scripts didn't match field realities. Estimated restoration times looked optimistic, then ridiculous. A supervisor flagged the substation by the river for floodproofing again. The capital planning committee punted. Budget was tight, lead times were longer, and the projection said the risk was within tolerance. At a town council meeting, residents asked about frequent flickers that ruined refrigerators and fried a home oxygen machine. The company sent a regional manager with a slide deck and a soft voice. He promised reviews, reminded everyone of regional weather patterns, and pointed to a forthcoming resiliency plan. The council nodded. Winter was 3 months away. Meanwhile, upstairs, the investor relations deck bragged about value creation levers. The exit timeline penciled in: 3 to 5 years to polish the asset, then an IPO spin or a sale to a strategic buyer. The fund clock ticked. Debt amortization stepped up next year. A refinancing depended on keeping the story smooth and the dividends coming. That meant the same thing it always meant: hold OPEX flat, push CAPEX into rate base, avoid ugly surprises. The crews monitored the forecast. A polar front thickened over the plains and aimed east. The operations planner asked for extra contractor crews on standby. Procurement hesitated. The standby rate looked high. Finance suggested shifting to call when needed. The planner stared at the map, then at the policy. He signed anyway. It wouldn't be enough. How leverage hits the grid. Cash moved like water through a series of gates, and debt sat at the top gate. Every month, the utility's operating cash landed in the holding company's account waterfall. First came interest on the senior loans, then fees, then any mandatory amortization. Only after covenants were satisfied could money trickle back down for extras. If metrics slipped, the lockup snapped shut. That wasn't theory. It shaped every schedule, every purchase order, every can this wait email. Inside budget meetings, the distinction that mattered wasn't moral, it was mechanical. Maintenance CAPEX versus growth CAPEX. Maintenance kept what existed alive: poles, transformers, reclusers, the unglamorous guts that bore weather and age. Growth added assets with a clear regulatory return: AMI meters, substation automation, a new feeder for a tech park. Growth built rate base. Maintenance mainly preserved it. Under leverage, the preference wasn't subtle. Projects that could be capitalized, depreciated, and rewarded in the next rate case flew through. The rest queued up behind debt service. Reliability targets sat on the wall, Sadie and Sci-Fi with quarterly thresholds. Hitting them unlocked executive bonuses and kept regulators calm. But in the same deck, finance posted EBITDA margin, free cash flow to equity, and interest coverage. 2 clocks, 2 stressors. When a crew chief asked for an extra bucket truck to accelerate a cutover, the question returned as a ratio. Did it move Sadie enough to justify the hit to free cash flow? If not, defer and manage the optics. Accounting turned into a bridge. If a line rebuild could be bundled with a smart switch and a communications upgrade, it could be booked as modernization rather than bare maintenance. If vegetation work aligned with a grid-hardening plan, a slice could be capitalized into a multi-year program. The gray zone widened. Spreadsheets recast the same work with different labels, matching the covenant calendar. It wasn't fraud, it was fluency in the levers that kept the lockup from tripping. Meanwhile, regulatory design offered a safety net, just not for customers. Riders and trackers let the company true up fuel costs, storm costs, even certain labor and material spikes. In practice, that meant volatility moved to bills. Bondholders got predictability. Households got line items they didn't understand. When storms hit, the company would file for securitization, turning extraordinary costs into long-term charges. The debt stack above the utility liked that. It made the operating company's cash flow look smoother. This was the tension baked in. Bondholders and lenders demanded stability, predictability, and discipline. The grid needed redundancy, slack, and messy buffers. The spare transformer on a pad, the extra crew on standby, the tree trimmed before it looked risky. Those buffers are expensive and uncertain. They live in the gap between financial targets and physical resilience. Every time the company shaved a contingency, interest coverage breathed easier. Inside the control room, the translation was practical. Spares inventory. Targets tightened. Why keep 3 when the data said average failure rates supported 2? Lead times stretched, but procurement modeled just-in-time deliveries off past weather. Mutual aid contracts shifted to as needed, trading higher certainty costs for lower run rate OPEX. On a calm day, the plan looked efficient. On a bad day, the plan had no muscle. There was also the quiet effect of covenants. The debt terms included restricted payments tests and leverage thresholds. Fall below an EBITDA target, and discretionary spending froze without a formal memo. Managers learned to anticipate the choke point. They'd stagger work in the last month of a quarter, hold purchase orders in a draft folder, or book a fix as a pilot funded out of an innovation bucket. The goal was survival through the reporting cycle. Finance didn't ignore reliability, it measured it. But the metrics were averages, and averages hide tails. A neighborhood that suffered 5 long outages a year didn't move sci-fi, much across a service territory of hundreds of thousands. The people on that feeder felt forgotten. The spreadsheet saw a rounding error. When a director proposed a targeted rebuild, the business case competed with a system-wide IT upgrade tied to an investor day talking point. Guess which one? The lender's view showed up in diligence questions. Are there penalty mechanisms if SAIDI thresholds are breached? How material? Can storm costs be recovered? Over what horizon? Are there statutory caps on annual rate increases? The answers shaped pricing and flexibility. The company's leaders heard the message. Keep penalties small, keep recovery mechanisms wide, keep politics friendly. Reliability, in that frame, was a contractual risk, not an engineering ambition. And then there was the human pace of work put against the quarterly pace of finance. A supervisor knew that moving from a 4-year to a 3-year vegetation cycle would cut outages on wind events. Finance saw $12 million over 3 years that didn't obviously lift rate base. The compromise was a risk model that concentrated trimming in higher density zones to protect SAIDI faster. Rural laterals waited. A storm doesn't care about density. By the time the polar front started to form on the weather models, the grid's resilience was already priced. The spare stock was lower, the crews thinner, the mutual aid calls less certain. The company wasn't reckless, it was leveraged. Debt isn't a villain, but it sets the metronome. And when the beat quickens, everything that doesn't fit the rhythm gets pushed to the edge of the score. That edge is where weather writes its own terms. The storm test. 3 days before landfall, the forecast tightened. Sub-zero air knifed south, moisture rode in behind it, and the line where rain becomes ice set up right over the service territory. The contingency budget had been trimmed at mid-year. Spare parts sat on a spreadsheet labeled acceptable risk. The planner refreshed the modeling tool and saw what he already knew. If ice accreted past half an inch, the weak spots would go first. By dawn, freezing rain lacquered everything. On the rail corridor, trees bowed, then cracked. A feeder blinked, reclusers tried twice, then locked out. In the river district, water crept where maps had warned it would. The substation berm, still unraised, held for an hour and then seeped. The first alarms chirped, then stacked. Breaker trips, low voltage, communications lost. Dispatch zoomed the map and watched the red expand. Crews rolled, but there weren't enough. The standby contractors the planner fought to pre-authorize were still driving in from 2 counties away. Those who hadn't taken better paying calls elsewhere. Mutual aid calls went out. Replies came back slower than anyone liked. Several partners had their own ice lines to manage. One contractor texted, "Short on drivers. Can do 4 trucks by evening." The operations chief exhaled and reprioritized on a whiteboard already smudged to gray. At the river substation, a sump pump wheezed. A tech waded shin deep to check the control house and found the door swollen tight. Upstream, a tree took the line clean off an aging crossarm. A crew chief radioed in that he needed a special transformer bushing that procurement had pushed to next quarter. The warehouse had won. The other had been canceled to hit a cash target. They salvaged parts off a retired unit, losing an hour and a half. Inside the call center, outsourced agents read scripts that didn't match conditions. Estimated restoration times pulled from an algorithm trained on milder storms ticked out in 6-hour windows. People heard numbers, made plans, and then watched the hours slide. Parents tried to keep kids warm with stovetop burners. A dialysis patient called 3 times, then dialed 911. The hospital's generator lit, stuttered, then steadied. A supervisor flagged critical load feeders with a pink highlighter and told dispatch to hold them sacred. Meanwhile, emails flew with a different tone. Investor Relations wanted talking points for a lender call. At 4 p.m. Treasury asked if storm costs would qualify for securitization under the state statute. Legal reminded everyone to document extraordinary measures. The CFO wrote, maintain guidance if possible. Emphasize resilience investments underway. The operations lead didn't answer. He was on another line approving load shedding to save a transformer that would take 9 months to replace. By night, the map looked like a wound. Rolling blackouts rotated through neighborhoods to keep the system from collapsing in chunks. Rural laterals waited. A farmer texted a line worker he'd known for 20 years. Any chance tonight? The line worker on his 16th hour said, if the parts truck makes it. The parts truck got stuck behind an overturned semi on the state road. Salt shortage, another quiet budget line that got shaved. Contractor no-shows compounded it. A crew promised by a large vendor never left their yard. Their dispatcher had a conflicting commitment 2 states over. Overtime caps that finance had imposed during normal weeks were lifted on paper, but the crews were already thin. The new hires hadn't seen a storm like this. They learned in real time, under ice in the dark. A veteran kept them safe, calling more hot work than he liked because de-energizing would cascade into hours they didn't have. At 2 a.m., a near miss snapped everyone back. The hospital feeder sagged under an ice sleeve and a switch that should have been replaced last fall. A relay misset in the last software update almost tripped. A tech caught it, by instinct more than data, and held the line. He didn't log the adrenaline, just the fix. Later, someone would ask why the setting review slipped. The answer would be a meeting that ran long on a strategic initiative. Morning brought reporters and drones filming ice-glazed streets. The outage map refreshed in chunks, lagging reality by hours. Customers saw their dot go green, then back to red. Social media burned. A mother posted a photo of her kid under 3 blankets with the caption, Day 2. The company tweeted safety tips and the number for warming centers. Regulators called for hourly updates. A commissioner asked for an assessment of whether maintenance deferrals contributed. Legal suggested careful phrasing. Debt markets noticed. Bonds widened as traders, far from the ice, read alerts and marked models. Insurance called about claims and deductibles. Covenants didn't care about weather, they cared about numbers. The CFO watched liquidity projections and asked when load would normalize. Operations answered with contingencies. If the thaw arrives by Friday, if winds don't pick up, if the next front stays south. None of those made a lender term sheet easier. Restoration settled into a rhythm. Critical loads first, hospital, water treatment plant, the 911 center. Then dense neighborhoods where one fix lifted thousands. Rural spurs last, because that's how Sadie math works. Crews worked until their hands shook and their cheeks burned. A supervisor in a pickup ate a peanut butter sandwich hard as a board and thought about the maintenance job he'd begged to move up the schedule. The budget meeting that demoted it had ended with, we'll revisit next quarter. By day 4, lights returned to most. The ice let go in long, dangerous sheets. A handful of pockets stayed dark. Broken poles in a stand of trees the vegetation team hadn't trimmed since the cycle change. The final numbers would look survivable in a deck. Outage durations inside a worst-case model, penalties minimal, storm costs headed to a rider. In living rooms and small businesses, it felt different. The gap between a ratio and a room at 38 degrees had a smell, a sound, a memory. Behind the scenes, the emails told another story. Not just the storm, but the choices that shaped it. Inside the control room. The control room smelled like burnt dust and coffee that had been reheated twice. Screens stacked in a semicircle showed a territory lit with blinking alarms. Dispatchers wore headsets and a look that said they knew every feeder by nickname. The decision wasn't whether to cut load. It was where to carve so the whole thing didn't tip. Load shedding is a blunt instrument. You shed in curated blocks to keep voltage and frequency from spiraling. Tonight, the dispatch lead pointed to a list flagged by engineering weeks earlier. Feeder sections that stressed a substation transformer they couldn't afford to lose. They carved those first, trading a few hours of darkness for 9 months of not waiting on a replacement that suppliers now quoted in seasons, not weeks. A young operator watched the voltage sag on a rural loop and asked if they could hold it 5 more minutes. The veteran beside him shook his head. "You'll cook the bushing." He typed the command and watched 1,000 homes blink out so a single transformer, older than either of them, could survive to carry tomorrow. Safety slipped into the room like a worry. In storms, you choose between cold work, everything de-energized and verified, and hot work, where gloves and sticks keep humans alive while lines carry power. Cold is safer but slower. Tonight, slow meant neighborhoods at 28 degrees and a hospital flirting with a trip. Supervisors on the radio weighed each task. Hot to clear the branch at pole 193. Pause. Do it with the senior on point. No shortcuts. Time on task crept past the point where hands stopped listening. The staffing model had trimmed crews and leaned on overtime caps that made sense in July. In January, caps lifted, but fatigue didn't. A line worker on his 16th hour missed a step off a truck, caught himself on a mirror, and kept going. He had a voicemail from his sister he hadn't played. His father was in hospice. He told himself the call could wait until the next stoplight. Vendor bottlenecks didn't care about courage. The procurement team had shifted to lean inventory. Transformers that used to sit in a secure yard as silent insurance were now purchase orders waiting on a ship and a factory already at capacity. When a recluser failed, the field crew called for the spare that should have been 3 miles away. Logistics radioed back. Next best is a size up, 40 miles out, truck en route. 40 miles was a lifetime with ice still falling. Meanwhile, the executive thread tugged. An email flashed. Maintain messaging. Investments in resilience. Customer safety are priority. Guidance unchanged for now. The dispatch lead didn't open it. He was approving a manual switching order to reroute power around a flooded substation. It would load a separate feeder close to its thermal limit, but it kept the water plant online. Optics could wait. Water couldn't. Across town, a vendor warehouse closed early. The owner couldn't reach employees on iced roads. A supervisor deputized a crew to retrieve parts from a secondary yard. They found the gate frozen and, with permission, cut the chain. The authorizing manager typed the exception into a log he knew legal would read. He didn't add that the bolt cutters came from his trunk because the company set stopped buying them to centralize tools. Then came the near miss. The hospital feeder sagged, a relay setting not audited since the last software push saw noise, and a protection scheme prepared to trip. In the control room, a protection engineer leaned in, eyes flicking between oscillographs and event logs. He recognized the pattern from a training slide buried 3 tabs deep. Hold it. Don't let it clear. He issued a block and sent a field crew to clamp a temporary fix. The generator didn't have to carry what the grid could still hold. Later, someone would ask how the setting review slipped. The answer would be a calendar that overflowed when a transformational initiative drew every engineer with a pulse. Vendors promised trucks that didn't arrive. A national contractor rerouted crews to a neighboring utility that paid a higher standby rate. Their dispatcher apologized. "We'll get there by morning." The control room marked them gray on the board and moved tasks to crews already stretched. Mutual aid, once a handshake between superintendents, now flowed through rate sheets and indemnity clauses. Friendship helped, but not as much as price. At 4 a.m., the ops chief walked the room, tapped shoulders, asked what they needed. One dispatcher said, "Better ETAs and fewer pep talks." He nodded. He knew the CFO's message about meeting guidance would land badly, but he also knew a covenant test in 2 weeks would dictate which invoices got paid first. He pushed both thoughts down and told the room the truth he could offer. "We prioritize life and equipment. Everything else waits." By dawn, the worst passed. The room exhaled, then braced for the thaw that snaps lines like twigs. A tech typed an outage-coded note about a switch overdue for replacement. He used precise language because legal would parse every word. On another screen, an email thread asked for a draft of remarks to regulators. The ops chief rubbed his eyes. The lights would come back. The bills and the questions would arrive next. The bill comes due. The lights came back one neighborhood at a time. Then envelopes arrived, white, ordinary, carrying the storm in fine print. A new line item sat under delivery charges, storm cost recovery rider. Another, infrastructure modernization tracker. The total was higher than last winter, higher than last month, and the explanation read like a contract written for someone else. Inside regulatory filings, the company moved fast. They submitted a petition to recover extraordinary storm restoration costs, attaching affidavits, invoices, and photos of iced lines and broken poles. Securitization appeared on page 3. Turn the sudden expense into bonds repaid by customers over 10 or even 20 years. It softened the shock per bill while hardening the obligation. Finance called it prudent. Households called it a surcharge. Both can be true, and that tension is where trust lives or dies. The mechanics were dense. Riders true up quarterly, trackers reconcile annually, deferrals stack until a future rate case folds them into base rates. Each piece had a statute behind it, built over decades to stabilize utility finances. In practice, it meant the storm's afterlife would live on bills, a few dollars here, a few dollars there for years. The debt up the corporate chain stayed current. The debt born of ice moved to kitchen tables. Public hearings filled with faces you don't see in earnings decks. A retiree in a wool cap held his bill and said, "I paid more for less." A bakery owner explained how 2 days dark killed her week's margin. A nurse described recharging medical equipment at a neighbor's house and then reading about resilience investments in a company press release. Heads nodded. The room wanted accountability and a fix. The company's regulatory vice president sat straight-backed, voice even. The storm was rare, she said. The costs were unavoidable. The mechanisms were standard. Experts followed with testimony that sounded neutral until the numbers landed. A consultant walked through the cost categories: labor premiums, mutual aid charges, materials at surge pricing, logistics. He noted the prudent standard: were costs reasonable and necessary? A consumer advocate asked whether deferrals in vegetation management and substation hardening increased the severity. The answer framed deferrals as risk-based prioritization. The advocate held up emails about cycle changes and a flagged flood berm. The room exhaled. Credit rating agencies weighed in by memo. A downgrade would raise borrowing costs, the company warned, and that would ultimately pressure rates. It was a familiar move: point to an external judge to justify recovery. The commission staff asked for more documentation: purchase orders, vendor rates, mutual aid dispatch logs. The company's lawyers argued that some details were commercially sensitive. Redactions thickened. Trust thinned. Politics pressed in from both sides. Mayors called for relief for small businesses. A state senator asked whether the company had paid a dividend to its parent in the past year. The answer was yes, routine, they said, tied to long-term capital needs. A reporter found the management fee paid to the fund and put the number next to the requested surcharge. The juxtaposition did its own math. 4 fixed-income households, the bill wasn't theory. A woman on oxygen told the hearing officer that the outage fried her backup unit, and the new rider would take money from her grocery budget. The utility offered a payment plan, a hardship program, and a fund seeded by voluntary donations. The commission chair asked whether storm securitization could exclude the first block of essential usage. Legal explained statutory constraints. The chair frowned and asked staff to draft options. Behind the microphones, a second negotiation ran on email. The company floated a settlement: accept most costs for recovery, disallow a sliver to show discipline, add reporting requirements on vegetation and substation upgrades. In exchange, the rider would start next quarter, smoothing cash needs and pleasing lenders. Consumer advocates pushed for more: penalties for missed reliability metrics with real dollars, not token credits. The company warned that punitive measures could chill investment. Everyone knew investment would continue. The question was at what return and for whose benefit. Meanwhile, bills kept arriving. People compared totals on neighborhood Facebook groups, circled the new lines, shared screenshots of outage maps that had gone green, then red. A small factory owner called the commission's public comment line and said he'd delayed a hire to cover his utility bill. The line clicked, recorded, filed. In the end, the order split the difference. Securitization approved, with conditions: a modest disallowance for certain contractor rates deemed excessive, enhanced reporting on maintenance, and a plan to revisit vegetation cycles. The company issued a statement about partnership and resilience. The riders took effect. The next storm season moved closer, and the realization spread: this wasn't a one-off. Across states, across holding companies, the same filings, the same riders, the same public lines. A pattern, not a fluke. The pattern: private equity's utility playbook. What happened in this town didn't invent a playbook, it followed one. Roll-ups came first. Distribution systems that once belonged to city-owned departments or regional operators got aggregated under a single fund's umbrella. The pitch to investors was scale. By 3 or 4 neighboring utilities, centralized procurement, harmonized software, and claimed synergies that looked tidy on a slide. In practice, local quirks, soil that rots poles faster, wind corridors that punish laterals, got averaged out by people who managed from a dashboard. Financial engineering threaded through the structure. The operating utilities sat in neat boxes, but the real leverage lived upstairs, at holding companies with their own debt. Fees skimmed along the way. Monitoring fees paid quarterly to the fund, transaction fees when an asset was acquired or spun, advisory fees for integration. If cash flowed, a dividend recap refinanced debt and sent money to investors mid-hold. Ratepayers never saw those memos. They felt them when budgets tightened. Standard tactics followed, predictable as the seasons. Vendor consolidation promised discounts. It also thinned the bench of local suppliers who answered calls at midnight. Vegetation cycles stretched in places where branches grow fast and winds come early. Spare inventory moved from yards to spreadsheets. Asset monetization crept in, selling a fiber loop to a sister company, leasing back a warehouse, structuring a real estate trust around service centers. It freed cash today and added rent tomorrow. The grid didn't get lighter, the balance sheet did. Exit paths shaped time horizons. The plan wasn't to own forever. A spin into a yieldco, a sale to a strategic with a lower cost of capital, or an IPO when markets smiled. Each path rewarded tidy narratives over gnarly maintenance. The hold period clock ticked 3 to 5 years. Long-lived assets age on a slower clock. When those clocks clash, the asphalt patch beats the full rebuild. The software upgrade beats the pole replacement, and the promise of Phase 2 floats to the next owner. Incentives told the rest of the story. Fund life is finite. Carried interest vests on realized gains, not on resilience achieved. The utility, by design, offers steady cash. Add leverage and fees, and the numbers get juicier, so long as reliability metrics don't crater. The tightrope is to shave cost while holding the averages. Outlier neighborhoods bear the bend. Their outages don't spike the territory sady enough to ruin a quarter, but they teach people a slow lesson about whose risk matters. Data across regions whispered the same tune. After acquisitions, public filings showed flat or slightly improving averages, while capital shifted to projects with clean regulatory returns. Meanwhile, investigative pieces highlighted pockets of repeated outages and deferred work that crews had flagged. In some states, reliability dipped after storms, then crept back, with riders filling gaps and securitization smoothing the accounting. The pattern wasn't universal, but it rhymed often enough to feel intentional. The roll-up logic rewarded internal trade. Mutual aid got routed first within the portfolio, not to the neighbor with the closest trucks. Bulk buying locked in prices. Good in normal times, less good when a local vendor with a key part stood outside the contract. Centralized call centers answered faster on a blue sky Monday and misfired during gray sky chaos when scripts ran ahead of reality. These weren't scandals, they were optimizations built for averages. Meanwhile, balance sheet levers multiplied. Holdco debt layered atop opco debt. Some deals promised ring fencing, separating the utility's finances from the parent's risks. The paper looked strong. Then, when cash got tight, upstream needs tugged downstream decisions. Delay a purchase order, slow a vegetation cycle, stretch replacement intervals. No one memo said skip safety. The cumulative nudge did. That's the psychology of drift, small concessions that add up. Regulatory architecture made the model safer for capital than for customers. Riders and trackers shifted volatility to bills. Fuel costs, storm costs, environmental compliance, all passable with the right filings. Financial risk thinned. Operational risk pooled where laws moved slower. When commissions pressed, companies pointed to credit ratings and the need for constructive regulation. Most commissioners knew the bargain. Keep rates politically tolerable, keep service decent, and capital will show up. It did on its terms. When exits neared, the playbook turned to polishing. Announce a multi-year investment plan heavy on smart tech and visible upgrades. Lock in a rate case that secures returns for the next cycle. Offload non-core property, book a gain, and reduce apparent leverage. If weather cooperates, sell into strength. If a storm hits, file for recovery fast, stabilize the story, and keep the data tight until the buyer closes. The new owner inherits the promises and the backlog, starts the clock again, and updates the deck. There were exceptions, operators who reinvested deeply, funds that took longer holds and strengthened systems. But the gravity of the model pulled toward short clocks and smooth charts. Crews felt it in the grind. Towns learned it during hearings. People learned it by candlelight. Regulators saw the pattern and tried to push back. Sometimes. Regulators versus models. While that pattern spread across portfolios, another arena set the rules. The hearing rooms where regulators weigh spreadsheets against lived reality. On paper, the maze looked clear. FERC oversaw wholesale power markets and interstate transmission. State commissions governed retail rates and most distribution reliability. Municipal boards ran their own systems. In practice, jurisdictional seams let responsibility slide when it mattered. Companies learned to route risk along those seams. To understand why, we need to go back to the merger gates. Big acquisitions had to pass public interest or no harm tests. Applicants arrived with economists, engineers, and promises. Rate freezes for a few years, capital plans with glossy renderings, service quality commitments tied to modest penalties. Conditions stacked up like guardrails. And yet, the financing lived one level up, in holding companies the commission couldn't fully touch. The model's heart beat outside the jurisdiction. Regulators leaned on ring fencing. Paper walls meant to keep the utility solvent even if the parent stumbled. Independent directors, dividend stoppers, money pools separated on charts. It looked sturdy, but ring fencing protects from catastrophe, not from the slow bleed of tight budgets. No statute forces a parent to spend $1 more than the minimum needed to meet reliability targets and rate case narratives. The law guards the vault door, while the floorboards thin one plank at a time. Rate-base rules added a twist. Utilities earn returns on capital investments added to rate base. Routine maintenance is an expense. The intent is sound, reward long-lived improvements. The incentive it creates is predictable. Dress maintenance as modernization and aim dollars at assets with cleaner returns. Regulators try to police that line. Companies arrive with binders of work orders and accounting memos that justify capital treatment. Staff ask hard questions, then settle for partial disallowances. The structure still tilts the field. That's not conjecture. It's reflected in many state dockets and filings. Enforcement tools exist, but they mostly bite after the fact. Service quality penalties kick in when SAIDI or sci-fi cross thresholds. Bill credits flow to customers when call centers blow response times. Those penalties are small next to interest expense or a dividend recap. Commissions can open prudence reviews after storms and trim recoveries if costs look out of line. By then, the outage happened, the freezer thawed, the hearing cooled. Prospective safeguards, staffing floors, vegetation cycles, spares minimums, are harder to impose and harder to defend in appeals. Case studies piled up. One commission conditioned a merger on keeping local control centers open and vegetation on a 3-year cycle. 2 years later, the company consolidated dispatch to a regional hub and shifted to risk-based trimming that, in practice, stretched the cycle. Compliance reports showed boxes checked. Outage clusters said otherwise. Staff flagged the gap. The company pointed to language that gave them discretion. Lawyers argued commas. The cycle stayed stretched. Elsewhere, a deal approval required ring fencing and a ban on upstream cash sweeps if leverage exceeded a level. When markets tightened and refinancing costs rose, the parent paused dividends and met the letter. Internally, budget committees trimmed everything that didn't punch through to rate base. Crews felt it in freight delays, postponed replacements, and pilot projects used to fund necessities. The commission saw reliable averages and couldn't reach the choices behind them. Sometimes regulators pushed, and it worked briefly. A Midwest commission ordered performance-based regulation with upside and real downside. Hit better than baseline reliability and keep part of the savings. Miss and pay a material penalty that shareholders, not customers, absorb. The first year, the utility hustled, more tree crews, targeted rebuilds. Reliability improved. In year 2, the parent sold to a buyer with higher leverage. The new owner accepted the plan, then flooded filings with alternative metrics and sought offsets through riders. The edge dulled. Meanwhile, companies perfected the approval dance. They front-loaded community benefits. Rate credits for low-income customers, charitable commitments, a shiny training center ribbon cutting. They promised local jobs while quietly planning shared services hubs a state away. They accepted reporting on maintenance pilots while steering dollars to IT programs that photographed well on Investor Day. Commissioners, wary of litigation and desperate to keep capital flowing, balanced headlines against dockets. Most chose conditions they could monitor and penalties they could defend. Courts hovered over all of it. When commissions tried to stretch public interest to account for fund life and holdco leverage, appellate judges asked where, in statute, that authority lived. When regulators attempted to cap management fees paid to parents, companies argued preemption or corporate separateness. In one case, a commission disallowed a slice of costs tied to an aggressive dividend recap. The court reversed, calling it hindsight. The next order trimmed coverage to narrower grounds. There were bright spots. A coastal state demanded detailed resilience plans with project-level transparency, independent audits, and a bar on capitalizing certain maintenance masquerades. Another state set minimum stocking levels for critical spares and tied rate recovery to those floors. A third required public reporting of outage risk by feeder, forcing sunlight onto the tails that averages hide. Companies complied, and then sought compensating relief elsewhere in the rate structure. The lesson that shares well: what gets measured gets managed, especially in public. While that was happening on paper, you could hear the strain in staff hallways. Veteran analysts worked storm dockets at midnight, trying to parse redacted vendor rates and trace delays to decisions, not fate. They knew the models, and they knew their ceilings. The company's models stared back, trimmed for covenants and fund clocks. The commissioners counted votes, counted dollars, and counted on the lights. Outside, the weather got louder. Legal shields and loopholes. While regulators wrestled with models, lawyers arranged the furniture so risk slid downhill without making a sound. The utility you saw on trucks and bills was an opco, tidy and ring-fenced. Above it sat holding companies with names that never appeared on a bucket truck. Those boxes mattered. If something went wrong, really wrong, the upstream layers claimed insulation. Bankruptcy remote entities kept the operating company separate, so lenders felt safe and parents could walk away cleaner than customers ever could. Limited liability stacked like plywood. The parent owned a holding company, which owned an intermediate entity, which owned the opco. Each had its own board, its own cash rules, its own promise that liabilities wouldn't climb the stairs. When outages triggered lawsuits, the defense brief started with a map of entities and ended with a reminder. Ratepayers had a regulator, not a tort claim. The people in the dark learned that corporate architecture is a kind of weather, every day until it isn't. Contracts wrapped the rest. Force majeure clauses sat in vendor agreements and insurance policies, listing acts of God in careful order. Storms, floods, wildfires. After the ice, those clauses woke up. The company argued that delays and non-performance by vendors were excused. Vendors argued back that the company's own deferrals made performance impossible. Somewhere, a judge would decide whether ice was extraordinary or foreseeable in January. The definition changed millions. Arbitration provisions closed doors before they opened. Many contracts required disputes to be resolved privately, with limited discovery and gagged outcomes. A contractor who knew a part was cut from inventory signed an NDA with the settlement check. A former manager with emails about a trimmed vegetation cycle faced a clause that required confidentiality and fee shifting if he lost. The story narrowed to what the company chose to disclose and what regulators could pry loose. Discovery hurdles were a strategy, not a side effect. In storm prudence reviews, commissions asked for the internal risk memos and board minutes where maintenance was weighed against ratios. The company produced summaries and redacted attachments, citing privilege. Lawyers stood on doctrine. Attorney-client communications are off-limits, work product is protected, trade secrets can be sealed. Staff counsel fought line by line, often winning more paper, rarely getting the memo where someone wrote, "We'll push the berm another quarter." Settlements arrived without confessions. No admit, no deny resolutions ended investigations into storm costs and maintenance accounting. The company paid a fine smaller than 1 month of interest expense and agreed to enhanced reporting. A non-disparagement clause bound parties from framing the outcome as fault. Press releases read like choreographed apologies to processes, not people. The real currency was time, closing the docket before the next rate case opened. Unknown to most customers, the financing documents themselves carried levers that bent operations. Credit agreements sometimes contained MAE definitions, material adverse effect, that carved out weather and regulatory changes, shielding lenders from arguments that storms should loosen covenants. Reliability covenants, when they existed at all, were vague, comply with applicable law. Nothing in those pages said keep 3 spare transformers, or don't stretch the tree cycle to 4 years. The law asked for service, the loan asked for cash. Meanwhile, class actions tried to knit scattered harm into a single voice. Plaintiffs' lawyers filed suits alleging negligence in maintenance and misrepresentation in public statements. The company moved to dismiss, file in the wrong venue, claims preempted by utility statutes, damages speculative. Some cases died early. Others limped forward until a confidential settlement closed the book for a handful of named plaintiffs. The rest of the town got riders. Insurance shaped choices too. Policies had retentions that made the first chunk of storm cost the company's problem. Above that, coverage stair-stepped with exclusions that had grown sharper after recent hurricanes and wildfires. Insurers asked hard questions about flood maps and vegetation cycles. Premiums rose. The calculus tilted further toward securitization and recovery. Risk didn't vanish. It migrated to bills with consent of law. A whistleblower considered going public. He had a logbook showing flagged equipment that slipped 3 quarters in a row. His lawyer read the employment agreement. Arbitration, confidentiality, clawbacks for disparagement. Regulatory hotlines existed, but protections were thin and retaliation could be quiet. No promotion, a transfer, a performance plan. He forwarded the log to a consumer advocate instead, redacting names. The advocate used the data without attribution. Truth traveled but limped. Courts, in the end, weren't built to tune grids. They interpreted contracts and statutes. When a commission tried to disallow costs tied to a dividend recap, the appellate court asked where the rule said dividends matter to prudence. When a city sued for outage damages, the court pointed to exclusive regulatory remedies. The opinion footnoted sympathy and affirmed the structure. In the lobby, the lawyers shook hands and headed to the next docket. Outside, the lines hummed, patched, reported, monetized. On the ground, workers and whistleblowers. The storm passed, but the grind didn't. In the yard, morning muster looked thinner than last year. Crew reductions came disguised as attrition management. Retirees took packages. Apprentices filled gaps with maps and grit. The skill that used to move by osmosis, from a veteran's hands to a rookie's eyes, now lived in a binder and a training module. The binder didn't answer when a crossarm split in sleet. A foreman kept a logbook, paper because paper couldn't be remote into a PowerPoint. He listed poles by mile marker, annotating with small truths. Guy wire loose, insulator crazed, woodpecker holes, watch next freeze. He'd flagged a switch near the hospital 3 times before the storm. Next to the 4th entry, he wrote one word, luck. He meant the relay catch that saved the feeder. He didn't say luck wasn't a plan. Do more with less slid from slogan to scent. Safety talk stayed daily, but the tempo of work crept faster. The choice wasn't whether to cut corners. It was whether to stack tasks in ways that made corners feel optional. A supervisor who used to insist on cold work signed off on hot more often, then stared at the signature like it belonged to someone else. He told himself he'd pad the next estimate to buy time back. The estimate came home with red pen marks, tighten, align with peers. Training gaps showed up not as errors, but as hesitations. A new hire froze at a manual recluse because he'd never done one outside class. The veteran beside him said, "I got it," and did. Later, in the truck, the veteran said, "You need reps." The kid nodded. The schedule didn't give him reps. It gave him routes and a tablet that graded his day by stops per hour. Vendors felt the squeeze too. A supplier who delivered crossarms on a handshake for 20 years now had a portal login and 90-day terms. When an invoice went unpaid past 100, he called a number that rang in another state. The person on the line couldn't pronounce the names of the roads he served. He thought about walking from the contract and kept delivering because crews he'd grown up with still needed parts. He started asking for half up front on specialty items. Procurement marked him difficult. Unpaid invoices accumulated like stress. A subcontractor waited 3 months for storm overtime that used to hit in 2 weeks. He called the GC, who blamed the utility, who blamed the verifier, who blamed the queue. He scrolled his bank app at midnight and drafted a text he didn't send. "My guys don't eat on in process." He took a payday loan at a rate that made him swear and showed up anyway. Not everyone swallowed it. A supervisor sent an email up the chain with subject line, "Deferred maintenance risk, Q2." He attached photos, a cracked crossarm, a spalled pole, vegetation swallowing a lateral that fed a mobile home park. He wrote without adjectives, just notes and dates. The reply came back 2 weeks later with a line. "Appreciate detail, aligned to risk model." He printed the exchange and tucked it behind his logbook. NDAs chilled what coffee couldn't warm. Offboarding packets came with clauses that read like muzzles. Arbitration, confidentiality, non-disparagement, clawbacks if reputations were harmed. A line worker who'd flunked a promotion after raising a staffing ratio complaint stared at the signature line. He wanted to tell a reporter about the relief he felt when the generator at his kid's school held. He signed, took the check, and mowed his mother's lawn to think. A whistleblower weighed his odds. He had a spreadsheet showing vegetation cycles extended beyond the approved plan in low-density areas, correlated with outage clusters. He also had a mortgage and 2 kids. The company's ethics hotline promised anonymity. Colleagues said it routed to legal. He called a consumer advocate instead, blocked number, outlined the pattern, mailed copies to a P.O. box with no return address. He kept 1 copy at a friend's house, because he'd read stories. Unions pushed where statute gave them grip. A local demanded staffing floors and fought discipline cases where refusal to do unsafe work got dressed up as insubordination. The company agreed to safety committees with equal seats, then sent managers with scripts and smiles. On a tour, a union rep pointed to racks that used to hold 3 spare transformers, now half empty. The manager said, "Global supply chain." The rep said, "Our chain starts here." Burnout wasn't a headline, it was a Tuesday. A crew member called in from his car at 6 a.m., voice flat. "I can't get warm anymore." He'd been fine a year ago. Now his hands shook on calm days. He'd stopped fishing. He told his wife he might quit, and then stared at the health insurance card. He stayed, and a month later missed a step and sprained an ankle that never healed right. Near misses climbed. Not the kind that make TV, the kind you log and move on. A boot slipped, a glove nicked, a truck backed into a pole nobody. Marked. The tally board on the wall still showed 3 days since last incident. The number reset to 0, and then to 1, and then to 2, like a game with rules that didn't map to the way skin scars. Some workers spoke up at public hearings, off the clock, out of uniform. A foreman in a plain jacket told the commission, "We know what needs replacing. We submit it. It slides." He didn't name names. He didn't want a performance plan. A commissioner asked if he believed the company retaliated. He stared at the microphone and said, "We believe in gravity." Communities watched crews work and separated the faces from the logos. They sent soup to repair sites and held signs at headquarters. They learned to file complaints, to ask for docket numbers, to demand feeder-level data. They took pictures of trees that grew back like the bills. They understood that the people up in the bucket weren't the ones writing the riders. They also understood that if those people quit, darkness lasted longer. While the lawyers argued, the workers adapted. They built informal safety nets, sharing parts, trading tips, texting warnings about bad spans. They hid resilience in friendships and habits the spreadsheet couldn't see. Then, bit by bit, communities learned to push back in their own way. Communities push back. The first meeting was small, folding chairs in a library room that smelled like old paper. A teacher, a farmer, a nurse, and a retired line worker put bills on the table and said the same sentence 3 ways. "We pay, we wait, we're not heard." Someone passed around copies of a feasibility study from another town that municipalized in the 1980s. "Public power," the teacher said, "means we can set priorities." It sounded abstract until they listed names of people who'd sat in the dark. They learned fast. Municipalization isn't a slogan. It's a bond issuance, a vote, and a fight. The group mapped the steps. Petition the city council to open a study, hire an independent advisor, calculate a purchase price for local distribution assets, draft a transition plan for employees. The utility sent a letter warning that acquisition would be expensive, complex, and risky. The farmer read it twice, folded it neatly, and said, "So is losing a freezer full of beef." Ballot language came next, short enough to fit on a yard sign, long enough to stand up in court. The company worked the airwaves with ads about government takeover and hidden costs. The campaign answered with door knocks and microstories. The bakery that tossed dough, the mobile home park that waited, the oxygen machine that failed. They used before and after photos and a simple message. Pay once for prevention or pay forever in riders. A volunteer kept a spreadsheet of undecided voters and drove them to see a municipal utility 2 towns over where the manager showed undergrounding maps and a small surplus plowed into rate relief. Negotiations started before the vote. The city hired a former commissioner as negotiator, a calm man who asked for asset lists, depreciation schedules, and easement maps. The utility countered with high valuations and a reminder of ongoing obligations. The negotiator said the quiet leverage. We don't need to agree. The ballot measures leverage too. The company blinked and offered reliability commitments if the city dropped the measure. The council put both options on the agenda and let the room fill. People lined up with bills in hand and 3-word asks. Clear timelines, visible audits, automatic credits. Elsewhere, co-ops offered a different path. A cluster of rural customers formed a committee to explore switching service to a neighboring cooperative willing to sign a long-term power purchase agreement with transparent pass-throughs. The co-op manager brought donuts, not decks, and talked about member votes and margins measured in pennies. It wasn't cheaper on every line item, but it aligned incentives. Keep lights on, keep bills predictable, keep ownership local. People liked that math. Environmental justice advocates changed the tone. They mapped outages by census tract and layered them against income and tree canopy. The picture wasn't subtle. Low-income neighborhoods lost power longer and more often. A church basement became a war room. They demanded feeder-level data, published it in a zine, and marched to a commission hearing with signs that said, "Equity is reliability." The company's spokesperson said they serve everyone equally. A grandmother stood and described her block's 4th multi-day outage in 3 years. "Equal on paper," she said. "Not on my street." Media pressure cracked the narrative open. An investigative reporter obtained internal emails about vegetation cycle changes and parts shortages, then filmed in front of a line where branches still brushed conductors. The story spliced a CFO's talking points with a foreman's logbook and a mother boiling water on a camping stove. The piece didn't accuse, it showed. Calls to lawmakers. Spiked the next morning, and a state senator, who'd kept his distance, requested a special hearing. With cameras rolling, city halls found leverage. "If we can't own it," a mayor said, "we can restructure the franchise." They drafted renewal terms with teeth, staffing floors, spares minimums, vegetation cycles with independent audits, public dashboards with feeder-level outages, and automatic bill credits that actually hurt when targets were missed. The utility pushed back, then traded around the edges. The mayor kept the audits and the credits. "Optics won't keep kids warm," she said. The clip traveled fast. Sign-ups for the next hearing doubled. Some places went further, community benefit agreements tied to real projects. A neighborhood with a brittle feeder negotiated undergrounding for key segments, paid with a mix of federal resilience grants and company funds, with milestones and penalties for slippage. A workforce clause guaranteed apprenticeships for local residents and paid time for safety committees with worker seats and a public chair. The line workers noticed. Morale ticked up where the clauses had teeth. Investors adjusted without changing their core incentives. ESG slides grew busier. The company launched a Community Reliability Index, scored itself, and promised improvements. Communities learned to parse the numbers. They asked for raw data and third-party verification. A volunteer coder built a site that scraped outage maps and compared them to filings. When discrepancies appeared, a commissioner asked why. The company blamed caching. The coder smiled and posted the repo. The ballot in the library town drew a turnout that felt like a holiday. Early counts swung to yes, then tightened. The final margin missed municipalization by a few hundred votes. The room deflated, then reset. The city kept its negotiating committee. The utility signed a franchise with stronger terms than anyone thought possible 6 months earlier. The teacher taped a clause to her fridge. Automatic bill credits for outages over 12 hours uncapped. She called it motivation. Not every push looked like a campaign. A small business coalition negotiated a rider that smoothed winter bills for shops with thin margins, paid for by trimming a management fee the company had hoped to tuck into rates. A housing nonprofit won funding for resilience hubs, solar and batteries at libraries and churches where people could warm up and charge phones when storms hit. These weren't revolutions, they were stitches in a fabric communities could live with. The lesson repeated across maps. When people organized with facts, asked for documents by name, and paired outrage with options, the ground moved. The grid stayed the grid, wires, poles, budgets, but the story changed. Decisions that used to live in quiet rooms with covenants and calendars now had neighbors in the seats. The storm didn't choose who cared. The town did. The investor pivot. While town halls filled and franchise terms stiffened, investors rewrote the slides without touching the engine. ESG moved from the appendix to the front. Reliability got new KPIs with green arrows and footnotes. A sustainability-linked loan arrived with margin step-downs if the company hit grid resilience targets, defined by averages that the system already met on mild years. The debt was cheaper by a hair. The covenants didn't mention spare transformers. Insurance forced a harder turn. After a string of billion-dollar cat years, premiums climbed and exclusions widened. Underwriters asked pointed questions about wildfire protection zones, flood berm heights, and vegetation cycles by circuit. Deductibles rose. A risk officer briefed the board. We can't offload weather the way we used to. Finance nodded and circled securitization again. Push-tail risk onto riders, transform chaos into amortization. Bond desks liked the predictability. Kitchens paid the coupons. Those are documented shifts in insurer behavior after recent wildfire and hurricane seasons. Climate models changed the math investors used to quote. Consultants brought maps shaded by risk layers. Heat domes, riverine floods, derechos, fire corridors. The overlay with aging assets was the part everyone stared at. In the portfolios, wildfire exposure pulled like gravity. Plans for covered conductor and fast trip reclusers showed up, promising measurable risk reduction. Undergrounding entered the conversation with six-figure per mile price tags and timelines measured in decades. The slide said prioritize. People on the ground said choose who waits. Risk transfer became a product line. Catastrophe bonds appeared, linked to storm severity or event counts, a hedge for a utility whose service area doubled as a target. Investors bought slices of weather risk and earned yield, unless it hit. The utility booked the coverage and told regulators it was prudent. The structure didn't change the grid. It changed who lost money when it broke. Customers still funded the premiums one rider at a time. Federal money arrived as a new buffer. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, then IRA-linked programs, dangled grants and tax credits for resilience and clean energy integration. Investor decks reframed projects as grant-enabled, cutting the equity needed and lifting returns. A substation flood wall moved from deferred to co-funded. A microgrid at a hospital got a ribbon and a senator at the podium. The cash lowered pressure upstairs. The priorities still followed the hold period clock. The ESG narrative matured into a choreography. An annual report highlighted a reliability uplift plan with target feeders, maps, and community meetings. The fine print revealed timelines that stretched past likely exits. An internal memo pinned milestones to quarters that mattered for refinancing. The company wasn't lying. It was pacing. The pacing protected interest coverage and investor day. The grid moved at that tempo, even when weather kept a different beat. Meanwhile, lenders priced climate into covenants. Some added disclosure requirements, physical risk maps, progress on critical hardening, third-party audits. The language sounded tough until the remedy section, cure by reporting, not by rebuilding faster. Only a few facilities flirted with performance triggers tied to outage metrics. Those that did measured territory-wide averages and allowed carve-outs for major event days. The days people remember didn't count against the ratios. That gap creates viral outrage because lived experience isn't an asterisk. Investors hedge geography. Funds with multi-utility portfolios spread exposure across regions, betting that heat in one state would be offset by calm in another. Inside a single service territory, that meant less appetite to overbuild resilience in any one town. The model preferred diversified assets and smooth distributions over fortress districts. Reliability became a portfolio statistic, not a promise to a block. Exit timing adjusted to the Weather Channel. A quiet storm season turned into a sell window. A rough season justified a reset narrative, new owner, fresh capital plan, culture change. Securities lawyers drafted risk sections that grew longer by a page each year, listing climate hazards like a litany. Buyers nodded. They'd seen the same list last week from a different seller. The price reflected who thought their model could make averages behave. On investor calls, analysts asked sharper questions. What percentage of vegetation miles are on a 3-year cycle versus risk-based? How many spare transformers per 1,000 miles of line? What's the median age of critical rec losers? The answers were practiced. We're optimizing spend, aligning with best practices, and leveraging data analytics. A few firms began publishing actual numbers. Their bonds tightened. Others promised to publish when systems are harmonized. The harmonization date slid. Viewers remember specifics. Vague timelines don't share well. Rate of return met rate of change. Electrification forecasts stacked new load from EVs, heat pumps, and data centers onto feeders that already groaned on hot days. Interconnection queues swelled with renewables and batteries waiting on wires. The company announced non-wires alternatives, contracting demand response and virtual power plants to relieve pressure. Investors liked the asset-light narrative. Crews asked who would answer when a control signal didn't clear a peak and the line smoked. The insurer's engineer toured the river substation with a clipboard and a new tone. He pointed at the berm and asked for the as-built. He circled a pump spec that missed the flood model by inches. He raised the deductible another notch and left a list. The company weighed the cost of meeting every line against the cost of the next rider battle. The spreadsheet won. The list became a roadmap in phases, timed to grants and filings. In the background, one shift mattered more than the slogans. The acceptance that volatility is now baseline. Investors stopped pretending weather was an outlier and started pricing it as a feature. The pivot wasn't moral, it was mathematical. The grid could harden in steps. The capital could flow with conditions. The open question lived where those lines crossed. Could a system steered by quarterly targets carry a century's job in a hotter world? The grid's new reality. Electrification didn't arrive as a press release. It showed up in parking lots full of chargers, heat pumps on porches, and a data center that glowed at midnight like a second sun. Load shapes warped. Peaks shifted later, valleys filled in, and the quiet 2 a.m. hours started to hum. The planner's models, once seasonal, went daily then hourly. Flexible demand moved from panel talk to a line item the control room actually counted on. Meanwhile, the interconnection queue grew like a stalled train. Wind in the plains, solar on warehouse roofs, batteries stacked in shipping containers, projects dotted maps but waited on wires. Developers submitted studies, paid deposits, and watched months stretch into years. Transmission choke points, decades in the making, refused to budge on the timelines investors wanted. A wind farm 40 miles away might as well have been on the moon if the substation it needed was already at the edge. Storm hardening had its own logic and its own limits. Undergrounding sounded simple until the numbers landed. Hundreds of thousands a mile in cities, less in fields, more under rivers. Crews prioritized corridors where critical loads lived and soils behaved. Elsewhere, covered conductor and fast trip schemes became the compromise. Let lines bite off faults faster, even if it meant momentary outages that customers felt as flickers. Sectionalizing switches carved networks into smaller bites so one tree didn't darken a whole zip code. Wildfire turned the calculus upside down. On hot, dry days, utilities ran with a hand on the brake. Public safety shutoffs took power down before sparks could find grass, trading certain darkness for maybe catastrophe. Communities hated it until the wind shifted and smoke smelled like memory. Covered conductor helped. So did rec losers that thought faster. But the one fix that changed everything, long, high-capacity transmission to move clean power around weather, stayed trapped in permitting and lawsuits that lasted longer than a fund's hold period. Supply chains made planning feel like gambling. Transformers that used to arrive in months now took a year. Copper theft turned storage yards into targets, adding security costs to parts that were already scarce. A purchase order wasn't a promise, it was a hope with a tracking number. Procurement learned to place bets across vendors and countries. Field supervisors learned to nurse old gear another season and save new parts for spans that fed clinics and pumps. Digital controls stitched the system together and tore a new seam. Operational technology, the gear that opens breakers and reads voltages, met IT networks that weren't built with wrenches. Cyber risk climbed out of conference rooms into night shifts. A ransomware note on the wrong server could push a control center onto manual for hours. Phishing emails weren't a joke when one click could fog outage maps or delay a switching order. The company hired security teams and ran drills. Crews kept radios charged in glove compartments because radios don't click links. Demand flexibility became the quiet power plant. Thermostats nudged set points up 3 degrees during peaks. Water heaters preheated at noon. Fleet chargers paused when a feeder strained, then caught up after midnight. Contracts called it demand response. The ops room called it relief. Virtual power plants aggregated thousands of small shifts and promised scale. On a good day, it worked like a choir. On a bad day, one app update failed and 1,000 silent promises didn't show. The takeaway was simple enough to spread. Don't bet the grid on a single app. Retail aggregation pressed from below. New companies offered customers lower bills if they let algorithms steer usage. The utility saw load evaporate when it most needed predictability. Regulators refereed. Customers picked the lowest number. The planning team adjusted forecasts and added another column for uncertain elasticity. Finance asked whether deferred wires could be replaced by contracts. Engineering asked what happens when a heat wave cooks contracts into paper. Data centers were the new elephant. They demanded megawatts with uptime measured in nines and backed by service-level agreements longer than some marriages. They wanted renewables, firmed by storage, wrapped in interconnection studies they didn't want to wait for. The utility saw growth and risk in the same handshake. A feeder built for warehouses couldn't carry a campus of servers without a rebuild. The rebuild needed transformers the company didn't have yet, crews it hadn't hired, and permits that took patience nobody had. Meanwhile, neighborhoods changed their own load. Rooftop solar flipped midday from draw to export. Batteries in garages learned to arbitrage, charging when prices dipped and feeding back when they spiked. The meter spun both ways. The utility's revenue model, built on predictable throughput, saw erosion at the edges. A pilot offered time of use, rates and credits for helping during peaks. It worked on spreadsheets and on pleasant spring days. It got fuzzy when a storm pinned lines and everyone's battery decided to protect itself. The control room adapted on instinct. Operators watched new dashboards that showed aggregated thermostats like a reservoir. They'd ping the aggregator and see a few megawatts melt off a peak. They'd smile until a software patch pushed an update that required customer reconsent, and the reservoir dropped by half in an afternoon. Redundancy redefined itself. Not just a spare transformer, but a second aggregator, a backup plan for the backup plan. In town halls, the debate shifted from who owns the utility to what do we ask the grid to be? Is it a delivery service that moves electrons as cheaply as possible? Or is it life support that needs redundancy that looks inefficient until the night you need it? Electrification pushed the question into kitchens. A heat pump that sips in spring demands a grid that stands in January. EV chargers that save money at noon don't help if power dies at dusk. The buyout logic met this new reality and found dull edges. Projects that paid in 10 years made financial sense for a pension fund with patience, less so for a vehicle that needed an exit in 5. Some owners adjusted, carving resilience into tranches they could finance and sell. Others doubled down on optics, smart meters by the thousand, apps with clean design, while the old switch on the hospital feeder waited another quarter. People inside the company started using a different word in meetings: slack. The grid needed slack like lungs need air. Slack was an extra crew on standby when the model said you could risk it. Slack was a third spare on a concrete pad with a fence around it. Slack was a vegetation cycle that trimmed before branches looked threatening. Slack didn't show up as ROI in the next filing. It showed up in a room that stayed warm when the map went red. The question hung there, unanswered but unavoidable. In a world where load grows, weather tilts and technology outpaces paperwork, who pays for slack and who gets to decide how much is enough? The breaking point. The week the town called the heat dome, air didn't move and the grid felt it like a fever. Peak after peak stacked with no nighttime relief. Transformers that usually cooled at 2 a.m. stayed hot as kettles. The planner's model flashed a color they'd almost never seen: sustained emergency. Leverage, climate, and age lined up like dominoes. The first to fall wasn't dramatic. It was a feeder that had carried too much for too long. Inside the control room, demand response fired. Thermostats nudged up, water heaters paused, fleet chargers idled. It bought hours, not days. A data center pinged for firm supply it had paid dearly for. The utility had promised nines. The dispatcher rerouted around a groaning substation and watched margins vanish. "We can ride this," someone said. The veteran shook his head. Not for a week. Prices in the wholesale market spiked. Gas units wheezed on old pipes. An intertie derated in the heat, cutting imports the plan had counted on. The company started rolling brownouts, not the tidy kind, short, frequent curtailments to keep equipment from crossing thermal limits. Industrial customers got the first calls. A glass plant throttled furnaces to save a feeder, product spoiled. A cold storage warehouse took a scheduled outage and lost inventory they'd insured, then learned the fine print excluded grid stress events. Political phones lit up. The governor's office dialed the commission chair. Emergency hearings convened in rooms that smelled like sweat instead of coffee. The opening question sounded simple. Why here, why now? The answer landed in pieces: older gear, deferred upgrades, a heat dome no one planned for, and load from electrification that hit faster than interconnection studies could clear. An aide held up a graph. Curve up, capacity flat. "Who let this happen?" he asked. The chair looked at the calendar and said, "Years did." Finance felt it as numbers. A covenant test loomed in 2 weeks. Leverage under a cap, interest coverage over a line. Heat pushed fuel and purchase costs up, revenue down with outages. The CFO called lenders with pre-reads. "We'll be close." A fund principal joined with a soothing tone and asked about non-core divestitures to pad liquidity. The operations lead stared at a photo of a transformer leaking and said, "We can't sell what keeps power on." On day 3, an equipment failure became a symbol. A main transformer tripped on high temp and didn't come back. The spare on the pad was a size mismatch. The right unit had been ordered, then slipped, then reprioritized. The team kludged a workaround with mobile units and tight switching. It kept a hospital and water pumps alive. It also meant a third of a district went to planned brownouts through the weekend with a script that said, "Thank you for your patience," and a map that told a harder truth. Debt spreads widened. Traders didn't wait for explanations. Insurance underwriters asked for hourly logs and thermal scans like they were ordering lunch. A downgrade watch note hit inboxes. The CFO drafted a liquidity plan. Draw the revolver, delay non-urgent payables, accelerate storm securitization already in process, and quietly prepare a rights offering at the holdco if covenants tripped. The fund weighed an emergency equity injection against optics and return math. "Bridge or bail?" someone asked off mic. The answer depended on the next 5 days. Workers felt the break in bodies. Heatstroke protocols went from binder to habit. Crews rotated out sooner, which slowed work, which lengthened brownouts, which spiked calls. A dispatcher apologized on an open line to a plant foreman who'd kept a shift alive with fans and faith. "We're not choosing you," she said. "The equipment is." The foreman cracked and said, "The equipment had choices too." That line trended because it captured cause and consequence in 6 words. Regulators moved from questions to orders. They demanded a prioritized list of near-term fixes and imposed a temporary ban on non-essential upstream cash transfers. A commissioner floated penalties tied to heat event performance, not annual averages. Legal prepped appeals and reminded everyone that extraordinary weather complicates causation. A consumer advocate replied, "Complication isn't relief." By day 5, the numbers forced a fork. Option 1. Slash distributions, halt fees, and pour cash into immediate hardening. Targeted reconductoring, temporary cooling rigs on key transformers, accelerated spares. It would bruise the fund, please the commission, and maybe stabilize reliability before school started. Option 2. Frame the heat dome as a black swan, file for extraordinary cost recovery, trim discretionary capex to preserve coverage, and explore a sale into a buyer with cheaper capital and a stomach for the headache. The board call stretched past midnight. Operations argued for reinvestment with a list of projects so specific you could draw them blind. A feeder segment through a canyon of rooftops that baked lines all day. A substation fan array. 2 mobile subs to bridge spares that hadn't arrived. Vegetation crews for a wind corridor that would wake in August. Finance ran scenarios. Penalties versus interest, equity versus stigma, sale price now versus after a fix. The fund's partner asked the question beneath the model. What gets us out whole? In the neighborhood, the breaking point sounded like a kid crying in a hot room. At a small manufacturer, It sounded like a switch clicking off, and the owner laying off 2 workers he'd planned to keep. On the control room floor, it sounded like the silence after a command that didn't trip a cascade because a tech caught it. The grid held barely. The covenant test didn't. The fund wired a bridge, thin and loud. The commission issued an emergency order with reporting that reached into procurement and stocking. The utility announced a heat resilience sprint with dates and crews. The data center got a curtain deal for backup diesel that nobody wanted to brag about. Customers got a one-time bill credit that felt like a bandage on a sunburn. Everyone called it a wake-up. The models called it a cost. The choice, the real one, landed on the same table where the buyout had started. Reinvest deeply on timelines that outlast a spreadsheet, or cash out fast and let the next owner inherit the heat. Rewiring incentives. The boardroom chose a bridge and a sprint. It kept the lights alive, not the logic. To change the logic, the incentives had to move. Performance-based regulation can do that if it bites both ways. Not soft bill credits that read like coupons, but material shareholder risk when reliability slips, with upside only when improvements last through heat and ice. Targets can't be averages padded by major event carve-outs. They need feeder-level floors that protect the tails where people wait longest. Capital structure oversight sounds abstract until a storm hits. Set debt caps tied to asset age and hazard maps, not to comfort with leverage. Disallow interest tied to holdco debt and rates. Don't let upstream financing costs sneak onto bills. If a parent wants more debt, it carries that risk outside the meter. True ring fencing has to go beyond paper. Independent directors selected with commission input, cash sweeps that auto-stop when reliability drops, and real veto power over upstream distributions in emergencies. Financing documents can be tools, not just tunnels. Bake reliability covenants into credit agreements, minimum spares, vegetation cycle floors, time-bound replacement schedules for flagged equipment. Make breaches trigger cash traps that keep liquidity in the OpCo until fixes land. Lenders will resist until they've priced 3 years of fire and flood. Then they'll ask for the same clauses. Transparency is the lever communities can pull. Require public reporting of maintenance and outage risk at the circuit level, with machine-readable data and independent audits. Post stocking levels for critical gear monthly. Publish vegetation miles trimmed versus plan by feeder. When numbers see daylight, optimizations that hide in averages lose their cover. Pair that with whistleblower protection that actually protects, anti-retaliation with teeth, arbitration carve-outs for safety disclosures, and bounties for verified risk reports that fix problems before hearings do. Regulators can reform rate base without starving maintenance. Draw a clearer line, capital where life extends, expense where it doesn't. Allow multi-year performance plans that pre-approve resilient rebuilds, not software that photographs well. Tie recovery to milestones the public can see. A rebuilt span, a flood wall poured, a mobile sub staged, verified by an auditor who answers to the commission, not the company. Community equity can anchor priorities. Offer a small ownership slice to the city or a community trust in exchange for franchise renewal. Dividends contingent on hitting reliability floors. Add worker seats on safety committees with authority and paid time, and one worker or community seat on the utility's regional board with agenda rights. It slows some meetings and speeds the decisions that matter. Insurance wants granularity. Use that pressure. Let carriers see project lists and reward real risk cuts with lower premiums. Then require the company to pass those savings through, not absorb them upstream. If catastrophe bonds hedge storms, disclose coupon, trigger, and cost on bills where riders live. If customers fund the hedge, they deserve the terms. Federal money should bend the arc, not pad returns. Make grants contingent on open data and workforce commitments, apprenticeships, local hires, and spares staged where hazard maps say they belong. Don't finance ribbon cuttings without the boring pad where a spare transformer waits. Measure resilience per dollar, as avoided hours out on the circuits that fail most. Publish it. Performance-based regulation, debt caps, ring fencing that actually fences, covenants that name parts, transparency that exposes tails, community equity that votes, worker seats that speak. None of it fixes weather. It fixes choices. It buys slack on purpose. It lets a dispatcher say yes to a spare that seems inefficient until the night it isn't. It puts the clock on poles, not exits. Which brings us back to that family in the dark. If this resonated, Share it with someone who's paid a rider after an outage. Resolution and meaning. Their lights came back. Their bill was higher. Their trust was lower. A grid is life support, and finance should serve that, not strain it. If you want the next chapter on who's building public alternatives and what real resilience costs, subscribe and watch our follow-up on community-owned utilities. There's a path that funds slack before storms. See how towns are taking it. And if this hit home, comment with your longest outage and what you were told. Those stories change hearings.